In part 1 of this video, we examine basic theory of small arms fire, and specifically that of machine guns, the basics of stripping and assembling, and care and cleaning of the Bren and its various parts, including the use of the various implements carried in the spare parts wallet and hold-all. In addition, some of the basic drills used with the Bren, including loading and unloading. In this, part 2 of the video, we'll continue the examination of the basic drills, introduce the function and use of the Bren tripod for both fixed-line firing and anti-aircraft work, and outline the tests required to be passed before actual shooting of the Bren could be undertaken. The Bren had a reputation for reliability and ease of use, but as it was a piece of mechanical engineering, it could stop firing for a number of reasons. The Bren was the most important weapon of the infantry section, and its inability to function was a supreme liability on the battlefield. Therefore, drills existed to remedy whatever had happened to the gun to make it stop. The first, or immediate action to be taken upon the gun not firing was thus. When the gun stopped firing.
Gun firing all right. Gun stops.
The weapon was cocked, then the magazine removed, and if the magazine and rounds appeared to be serviceable and loaded correctly, then the magazine was replaced, the weapon aimed and fired.
Gun firing all right. Gun stops.
With the number 2, the drill was essentially the same. If the magazine was empty, it was exchanged for a full one provided by the number 2. This drill remedied the most common causes of the Bren not firing.
Gun stops.
An empty magazine was the primary one, but would also mitigate a defective round that did not fire.
Gun firing all right. Gun stops.
Or a badly loaded or damaged magazine. In all cases, the immediate action was not considered complete until the gun was firing again. Being a gas-operated weapon, the Bren could suffer a stoppage if excessive fouling built up in the working parts. This impeded the flow of gas, which would then not be able to properly cycle the action. To remedy this, the gas stoppage drill was used. The men were trained to identify a gas stoppage by the immediacy of a second stoppage after the immediate action was performed. In training, the following commands were given. The gas stoppage drill was always presented in relation to the immediate action.
Gun firing all right. Gun stops.
The IA was performed in the usual fashion, and then the follow-on command.
Gun fires 1 or 2 more rounds. Gun stops again.
In this drill, the gun was cocked and the magazine removed. The action was fired and then cocked again. Then, using the combination tool, or perhaps more expediently an unfired round, the barrel was removed partially by pinching the barrel nut catch and lifting up. The carrying handle was used to push the barrel forward so that the regulator cleared the gas cylinder locking bar. The gas regulator was turned to the next largest hole as indicated by the dots on its lugs. Once the regulator was in its new alignment, the barrel was replaced, ensuring that the gas cylinder locking bar was able to slide into place. Once the barrel nut and the carrying handle had been rotated down out of the way and locked in place, the magazine could be replaced and the gun fired again. As mentioned, the regulator could be adjusted, perhaps more formally, with the use of the combination tool. The Mark I had a protrusion specifically designed to interface with the regulator. The use of the tool afforded a more positive grip, and its handle more leverage to overcome fouling. While the Mark II was a more simple design, and its edge was used to effect the similar result.
Gun fires 1 or 2 more rounds. Gun stops again.
Though relatively complex, the drill could be done quite quickly, and the gun could be brought back into action in a timely fashion. The regulator had 4 settings, each indicated by the aforementioned dot. These were aligned with the 0 mark set into the gas block. It was a simple and intuitive way to illustrate which setting allowed for more gas. The smallest dot provided the least, and the largest the most.
Gun fires 1 or 2 more rounds. Gun stops again.
Typically, the gun was set to the lowest setting that would afford reliability. If test firing was not an option, then setting 2 or 3 would be used. Interestingly, the gas stoppage drill seems to have been taught as a one-man evolution, though undoubtedly in the field, should it have occurred, the number 2, if present, would have helped in some fashion. In rare circumstances, the Bren could suffer some sort of mechanical malfunction due to an obstruction in the body or the chamber. A spent casing or part thereof might lodge itself within the gun and thereby impede its proper functioning. The drill was different than the gas stoppage drill in that the gun did not fire 1 or 2 more rounds as in that circumstance, but rather it would not fire at all after the immediate action was completed.
Gun doesn't fire.
The gun was cocked and the magazine was removed. The body was then examined.
Obstruction in body.
If an obstruction was found, such as a double feed or spent case, it was removed, the magazine replaced, and firing continued. If there was no obstruction seen, the presence of a separated case in the chamber was supposed.
No obstruction in body.
In this case, the clearing plug was required and withdrawn from the wallet. This device used a pair of sprung claws to grip the mouth of the separated case. The clearing plug was inserted into the chamber from above. This was a somewhat fiddly operation due to the geometry of the breech. The action was fired, then cocked, extracting the clearing plug with the separated case. Now clear, the magazine was replaced and firing resumed. This was perhaps the rarest of all stoppages. And we can see here the action of the clearing plug on the remnant of the case, with the sprung tines having been pushed through the case to grip it at the mouth. The case could separate at any point along its length, and the example created for this demonstration had the split just above the case head. Interestingly, an example of a separated case was recorded when firing live on the range during my aforementioned visit to the UK. Although it occurred when firing the Vickers, the separation, this time at the neck, was of a manner that could just as easily have happened with the Bren. In this case, as you will note, the separated piece stuck in the chamber was actually withdrawn by the chambering of the subsequent round, when the gun didn't fire and that round was extracted and ejected. It pulled the separated piece out, with the nose of that round wedged into it. Due to the fact that there was no integral way to cool the barrel after sustained firing, the barrel of the Bren could be changed for a second one, allowing the previous one to cool. Earlier in the war, there was prescription for the barrel to be changed after 10 magazines, or nominally 300 rounds. As of the 1942 updated PAM, barrel changing was mentioned almost in passing, and the number 1 instead was instructed to manage the heat buildup through adjustment of his rate of fire. The spare barrel not even being carried in normal, mobile offensive operations. In defense, where both the number 1 and number 2 would share the same static position, the possibility of changing the barrel would be much greater. To change the barrel, we assume the 10-round magazine limit had been reached.
You fired your 10th magazine. Barrel.
The gun was cocked and the magazine removed. The number 1 closed the magazine opening cover. The number 2 rotated the barrel nut, lifted the carrying handle, and removed the barrel. The spare barrel was withdrawn from the holdall, the regulator was checked, and it was placed on the gun, locked into place with the barrel nut. The magazine was then replaced, and firing could recommence.
Barrel.
Demonstrated here from another angle, we can see the operation of the barrel nut and the alignment of the regulator and gas block. Note also the interrupted screw of the barrel nut. Various carrying positions were used to manage the fully loaded 25-pound weight of the Bren gun. For short distances, or for maneuvering the gun in tight spaces, the trail could be used, with the gun held by a carrying handle. This allowed for quick dashes or local repositioning. For longer distances or more routine carriage, the sling could be utilized. The Bren could be slung over the shoulder much like a rifle, or could be slung across the front of the body. This allowed for the minimum of fatigue at the expense of having the gun ready for instant action. Administrative moves or lengthy patrols would see the Bren carried this way. An alternate to the sling was perhaps the shoulder carry. Here, the gun was hefted over the shoulder, and often the magazine was hooked behind the neck. Although seemingly a very casual and perhaps non-tactical method of carrying the Bren, this could also be used in a tactical guise, as the section or Bren group changed positions over intermediate distances where the trail might have been overly fatiguing. In order to move the gun whilst in a fire position on the ground, or while behind very low cover, it was grasped by the carrying handle and moved alternately with the firer. This way, the prone or semi-prone position could be maintained. While not at all a speedy process, the maintenance of cover or concealment in the approach to a fire position was often the critical factor in achieving surprise over the enemy. Although the prone position was the most common position, and the one that most of the training utilized, there were a number of variations and alternatives. The instances of deploying the Bren in near perfect, flat conditions would have been next to nil. The bipod would have gone a long way to lifting the barrel above vegetation or low obstructions. We can see here that with the bipod deployed and clearance enough for the muzzle attained, the Bren gunner would have been a very small target indeed. The Bren could also be used with the bipod folded and it resting on local cover. This kept a slightly lower profile if that was of special consideration. However, with the bipod folded, extra attention needed to be given to the clearance of the muzzle. The kneeling position was a useful alternative used when behind cover of intermediate height or from behind low cover such as a windowsill. We can see here the advantage of having the bipod folded in certain circumstances, ensuring as low a silhouette as possible. As with most use of cover, it was always advisable to shoot around the cover rather than over it. Variations of the kneeling position with the bipod folded could be used if appropriate. Despite the difficulties of local conditions, the Bren's mobility was an advantage when deploying in sometimes difficult circumstances. This angle demonstrates the advantages of shooting from the side of cover, limiting the exposure and presenting a much less conspicuous target. Training of this nature was critical in giving the infantryman the basic understanding of the capabilities of the Bren, allowing him to take advantage of its merits and develop the strength needed to handle the gun in perhaps adverse conditions. While perhaps at a theoretical disadvantage, being magazine-fed, the compact nature of the Bren showed definite advantage in mobility and handiness in maneuvering into positions that would otherwise have been extremely awkward for other, perhaps belt-fed weapons. When the ground sloped sideways, the bipod pivoted to accommodate. The earlier Mark I version with extendable legs was particularly handy in these situations. Especially at close quarters, perhaps during an assault, the Bren could be fired instinctively from the hip, and even short advances could be made this way. The age-old adage that the shovel was as important as a man's weapon was certainly true. The Bren could be used from a trench or other prepared position. Typically, the parapet would be positioned so that the gun and the bipod would just clear it, giving maximum protection to the firer. If surprise was particularly important, deploying the gun from the so-called position of observation would make for the use of concealment afforded by the trench. Once the enemy appeared, the gun was brought up to the parapet and the target engaged. Typically, the feet were kept square and slightly angled out, providing for maximum stability. As targets presented themselves, the body could be shifted with the attending change in stance, allowing for traversing fire or the switching of targets. Sometimes a parapet could not be completely prepared, and by placing the Bren on its folded bipod, the sought-after low silhouette could be achieved. In the end, the versatility and relative mobility of the Bren would see it used from many different and sometimes expedient fire positions. One of the key pieces of ancillary equipment, especially in the early war, was the tripod. These were issued at a rate of 1 per gun in the early war, and later this was reduced to 4 per company. These were intended to fulfill a number of roles. The tripod was of novel design and represented a concept by which the mobile and handy nature of the Bren could be used for more deliberate battlefield tasks. These were firing on fixed lines, and especially early on, anti-aircraft defense. The Mark I tripod featured an adjustable front leg with anti-aircraft mounting socket, the mounting pivot, a separate anti-aircraft leg stored in the main stays, the traversing arc, and the elevating nut and traversing slide with their clamps. The legs were adjusted by means of clutch plates and clamps located on each. The simplified Mark II tripod differed in the absence of any anti-aircraft capability and a non-adjustable front leg. The tripod was one of those items that seems to be a product of pre-war thinking. The ability to fire on a fixed line at a gap in an obstacle, such as a wire entanglement or minefield, or across the front of friendly positions to allow for close-in protective fire in low visibility situations, such as nighttime or when obscured by smoke, was deemed to be important enough to call for such ancillary equipment. The use of the Bren from its bipod deemed insufficiently able. With the tripod, the Bren could be laid or aimed at such a feature and held securely, allowing for fire to be delivered accurately and consistently at the same target. Obviously, this was more of a concern in defensive warfare, where the Bren, firing from dug-in positions, trenches, bunkers, and the like, was seen as an important role, augmenting the coordinated efforts of other weapons of the infantry and machine gun troops, namely the Vickers and the 3-inch and 4.2-inch mortars. The tripod did allow for engagement within the traversing arc, though such conditions would have had to have been quite favorable. And, as already mentioned, the importance of being able to augment any existing anti-aircraft defense with the Bren at lower level, perhaps platoon or even section, was deemed equally important. Here we'll demonstrate the use of the tripod deployed for fixed-line firing. Of slight historical note, the carrying strap demonstrated here is not wholly appropriate for use with the tripod. It is in fact a harness carrying infantry general service, used to carry heavier loads such as a stretcher or jerry cans. The conventional sling arrangement for the tripod was simply the use of 2 rifle slings. To deploy the tripod and mount the Bren, the tripod was first laid flat on the ground, with the mounting pivot to the front. The rear legs were rotated rearward in sequence by undoing the clamp, which disengaged the serrated clutch plate and allowed for rotated movement. Once in the appropriate position, which was for flat ground, generally in line with the frame, the clamp was tightened. Concurrently, the number 1 unlocked the front and rear mounting pins. We can see this demonstrated from a different angle. The tripod was made adjustable for obvious reasons. The ground would not always cooperate. Therefore, the legs were able to be adjusted in any myriad of positions. Once both rear legs were deployed, the front leg could be unfolded by undoing its clamp and rotating the leg downward and forward, clamping it when the appropriate angle was achieved. If required, the front leg could be unclamped and extended, if extra elevation was necessary, over a parapet or such. Following this, the traversing slide was then roughly centered on the traversing arc and clamped, ready for mounting the Bren. The traversing arc allowed for a 42-degree traverse from left to right. The Bren was then fixed by means of the front and... Whoa! Squirrel! By means of the front and rear mounting pins. Once in place on the mounting pivot, the pin could be pushed home and locked. The same function was performed with the rear mount, and the gun was now secure on the tripod. If space was lacking, the bipod could be folded forward, but this was not a prerequisite to effective firing. While the number 1 made final adjustments to the gun and the traversing slide and elevating nut, the number 2 was free to bring forward some of the ammunition supplies required to fire the gun. In addition, the holdall containing the spare barrel would have been particularly useful. Here we see the gun being fixed on the mounting pivot from a different angle. Note the method of locking the mounting pin into the gun. The same method was used to fix the butt to the rear mount. As mentioned, any adjustments made to the elevation or traverse could be achieved at this time. Once in proper position, extra stability could be achieved by using sandbags on the feet of the tripod. To dismount the gun and tripod, the reverse was performed. The Bren was removed by first unlocking, then withdrawing the front and rear mounting pins. Concurrently, the number 2 administered the ammunition and holdall, entrenching tool helves not being particularly important here. If the tactical situation demanded it, the Bren could continue to be used from the bipod in the same locality. The front leg was retracted if extended, and folded back so that it was in line with the frame. The traversing slide was moved to the side of the traversing arc, and the rear legs were unclamped and folded back to their storage positions. The tripod could then be carried away for redeployment or storage, and then the position policed for any dropped kit. As mentioned, the primary reason for the Bren tripod was to enable the gun to be used on a fixed line. While this would be relatively easy to do in daylight, by simply traversing and elevating the gun as necessary, it was the ability to in effect register the target for future and repeated use that made the tripod most useful. The first step was to lay the gun on the target.
600 house, lay.
With the target designated and range given, the sights were adjusted. In this case, 600. The gun was then laid or aimed by using the sights and the traversing slide and elevating nut. Once the gun was on, all clamps were tightened, securing the lay. You'll note that here, although the gun is actually laid on the target, the house with the red roof, the angle of the camera has been adjusted to allow for the sight picture to be explained and demonstrated. In the event of the Bren being used to cover the front of another locality, a minimum safety angle of 5 degrees was prescribed. This could be measured by using the graduations on the traversing arc. If the tactical situation allowed for it, the gun was actually fired at the target to confirm it was laid correctly. In order to make note of the appropriate bearing or direction of the lay, the sights were adjusted to 1800 yards without disturbing the gun. This had the effect of physically lowering the point of aim.
Take 2.
Following this, the number 2 was sent forward about 10 yards with his aiming post. The details, if any, of this implement are not included in the reference, but it may be in reference to the post and lamp as provided for the Vickers machine gun, or it could have been provided regimentally, made from local materials, presumably with a light-colored face, so it could be viewed at night or in low light. The post was adjusted, by means of simple hand signals, so that it closely matched the sight picture. Then it was fixed in the ground. So it's quite obvious here that the post was a provision to match the bearing or line of the gun, and didn't in any way reflect the elevation. The elevation was maintained by simply clamping the elevating nut. Now the drill using the post was the way it was prescribed in the 1939 manual. In the 1942 manual, it was simplified even further, using the traversing stops, clamping one each on either side of the traversing slide. So, with the gun laid and the target registered by means of the post and the elevating nut, the target could then be engaged using the normal application of fire. If necessary, the Bren could be removed from the tripod to engage other targets and then replaced on the tripod, returning to its registered fixed-line target. Shown here is a demonstration firing on the tripod live during my visit to the UK in 2022. Kevin being the dutiful number 2 here, sweating it out in 32-degree heat in his wool battle dress. Perhaps this demonstrates quite well that if possible, sandbagging of the tripod legs was of obvious advantage. Now, there remains one other method of laying on a fixed line, the details of which are found within the pages of Weapons Training Memorandum No. 1, published in March of 1940. This was the first of a number of updates and amendments to the body of weapons training across the Army. We have indeed seen this volume before in Part 1 of the video on close-quarter battle shooting. There, it was in reference to shooting from the hip. But for its relevance to the Bren, you'll have to wait until that video is produced as an annex to this one. In the meantime, you can try and guess what's inside this case. The other use for the tripod was to provide for an elevated mount for the engagement of aircraft. Now, it's important to remember that going into the war and during its early years, anti-aircraft defense was of huge importance. Air dominance was nowhere near achieved. Resultantly, all manner of measures needed to be taken. This was reflected in the Orbat of the Infantry Battalion, which included an anti-aircraft platoon of Bren detachments dedicated to this role. As the war progressed, this became less and less necessary, as Allied air dominance gradually grew. The anti-aircraft platoon was removed from the Orbat in early 1943. Having said that, the use of the Bren in the anti-aircraft role, particularly on its tripod, features prominently in photographic evidence from France in 1940, as well as the subsequent campaign in North Africa, the Western Desert, and Tunisia up to 1943. Its use wasn't confined just to those theaters. The home front, the Middle East, the Far East, and at sea were all places where the Bren gun found its usefulness in the air defense role. Anti-aircraft engagement was considered important enough in the early war to warrant a PAM of its own, which included a myriad of engagement techniques and skills with both the rifle and the Bren, and individually as well as collectively. While a dedicated examination of anti-aircraft training is not the preserve of this video, a general demonstration of the Bren tripod in the anti-aircraft role certainly is. To deploy the tripod for anti-aircraft use, first the folded tripod was laid on the ground. Then, the left side, as per the reference, was rotated up and the anti-aircraft leg half removed by first pulling out on the retaining pin, its handle being within the leg clamp. Then, the leg was rotated in the usual manner, ensuring that it was in line with the frame. The process was repeated on the other side. Following this, the tripod was raised up on its rear legs and pivoted back to the rear slightly. Then the upper half of the anti-aircraft leg was slotted into its mount, engaging with the anti-aircraft catch, located just beside the mounting pivot. The lower half of the anti-aircraft leg, with the foot lowermost, was inserted into the upper with a simple friction fit. The tripod could then be stood on its own. The front leg was unclamped, rotated up, and clamped again so that it was vertical. If necessary, it was extended as well. At this point, the Bren could be mounted on the anti-aircraft socket by means of the front mounting pin. Before mounting the Bren, the carrying handle was repositioned by first pulling out on the handle, which then allowed for it to be rotated to a lowered but perpendicular position near the left of the gas cylinder. This provided for a forward grip with which to control the gun whilst it was pointed skyward. In addition, the bipod could be folded forward, out of the way, though this was not necessarily required. The Bren was actually hung on the anti-aircraft socket, as that piece was actually open-topped and merely caught the gun's mounting pin like a hook. Regardless, the Bren could now be easily held skyward and targets engaged over a very wide arc. Ammunition was kept at hand with the magazine box positioned in a convenient place, and the number 2 providing a constant supply of ammunition. Incidentally, the gas regulator of the Bren was to be positioned at 4, or the largest port, to allow for the highest rate of fire, and aircraft were engaged with one continuous burst. An interesting expedient built into the system was for a replacement anti-aircraft leg. This came in the form of a normal No. 1 Mark III rifle. If for whatever reason the anti-aircraft leg was damaged or missing, the rifle of the No. 2 could be used by simply fitting it to the anti-aircraft mounting bracket by means of the bayonet lug, the dimensions of the bracket being specifically designed so. To dismount, the gun was unhooked from the anti-aircraft socket and positioned nearby. The front leg was retracted, then unclamped and rotated back to its folded position. The anti-aircraft leg was taken off 1/2 at a time and the tripod lowered to the ground. One side at a time, the rear leg was folded and the appropriate half of the anti-aircraft leg reinserted into the stay, where it was held by the retaining pin. This process was repeated on the other side. The Bren could now be brought back into action for ground targets, or taken out of action completely and stored. The final part of Bren training was the exam, known in the service as Tests of Elementary Training, or TOETs. Earlier in the war, this consisted of 7 individual tests, including magazine filling, loading, aiming, the IA and stoppages, barrel changing, and the mounting of the Bren in the anti-aircraft role. By 1942, this had become simplified. Loading, aiming and firing, the IA and gas stoppage, and a handling exam, in which the man was put through a number of basic evolutions behind different types of cover. The 1942 standard was performed thus. In test number 1, the man was given 10 seconds to load the Bren from the pouch.
Load!
Time stopped once the left hand was placed on the butt. Not included in the time was the doing up of the pouch. Test number 2 consisted of the use of the I-disc in a number of aiming practices.
250, automatic, fire!
These included individual sight settings. Though the term automatic is used here, the term bursts could as easily be applied.
400, automatic, fire!
The instructor could, as before, easily check the sight picture and the man's control of the gun when pressing the trigger.
600, automatic, fire!
There was no specific time standard for these drills, though it was understood that the sight setting wouldn't deviate by more than 400 yards. Test number 3 was the immediate action and the gas stoppage performed in series.
Gun firing all right. Gun stops.
The man had 45 seconds to complete both drills, and time was taken when the gun was fired again.
Gun fires 1 or 2 more rounds. Gun stops again.
Test number 4 was a handling scheme whereby the man performed elements of Lesson 11 from the manual, which included the position of observation, where both the man and weapon were hidden behind cover, then deployed rapidly for engagement of a target, the act of adopting fire positions behind cover, and the actions on the command stop, go on, as well as cease firing. These were simple drills, with the weapon simply being placed on safe and the magazine changed if necessary. On the command go on, the weapon was brought to either repetition or automatic, and targets were re-engaged. The command cease firing indicated the man was to unload the gun and then place a fresh magazine on it without cocking the gun. Although these specific drills aren't necessarily performed in this demonstration, the act of moving from cover to cover, then employing the gun using the drill specified, was the foundation of this particular test. And thus, with 2 ETs performed to the standard, the man was qualified to move on to the next step in his Bren gun training. In the next video in this series, we'll examine and shoot the 1942 wartime range course for the Bren. This would be the culmination of all the theory and drills thus taught, so that further, more advanced live-fire training could be conducted, and ultimately, the Bren operated effectively on active service. Thanks to friends of the channel, Jarrett, a regular China plate to quote a phrase, who lent his body and back to performing the number 2 drills, and to Bill for kindly providing the use of his Bren, tripod, and ancillary equipment, not to mention his backyard. Thanks must be extended to Rich of the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association, who have, as always, provided the period references used in this series, as well as facilitating my loss of Bren virginity in 2022. This video would not have been made had it not been for C&R Arsenal and their incredible close-knit community of friends. My undying thanks and appreciation go to all those who, by hook or by crook, or by the kindness of their hearts, decided to contribute as they could to make my visit such a success. Your hospitality, energy, generosity, and expertise are beyond reproach. Particular thanks need to be extended to Sven for provision of the Bren and copious amounts of ammunition. Matthias, May, Susie, David, Kristen, Sven, Hill, Jeff, Thomas, Henry, Aidan, and Bruno. You all spent untold hours of wrangling and sourcing the 14.5 million things that were needed to bring this project to fruition. I am truly humbled. In addition, thanks must be extended to James and the staff at the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada Museum and Archive for making available some of the arms seen in this project for photography and use. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well. If you'd like to view British muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment, free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place.